What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy and welcome back to part 2 of our Ultra Prism set review. So if you guys saw our first part, you actually might be thinking, how is there a part 2? It was like 3 hours long. How can you still have more to talk about? And while that may be true, and yes, our first part was very in-depth, so if you guys have not seen that yet, I will have a link in the description for you to check out the main bulk of our set review. But I did mention in there that there were actually some cards that hadn't yet been revealed to be confirmed to be in our Ultra Prism set. So typically in Japan, kind of what happens is they get kind of their main equivalent of our main set, but then they usually also have these mini sets released throughout the year, and sometimes we get cards from those mini sets. But however, at the time of filming for our earlier set review, those cards were not yet confirmed. But now we have the official set list has come out, and now we know that cards from the GX Battle Boost mini set were included in Ultra Prism. So today we're going to be covering those cards from Battle Boost that made it into Ultra Prism. And it's also, this video won't be near as long as the first part, just because we don't have an entire set to talk about, and actually a lot of the cards from Battle Boost that got printed in Ultra Prism are just reprints, which we are not going to be discussing. We're only going to be discussing new cards that appear, not reprints of cards that are already existing in the format. So with that being said, let's hop to it and let's talk about the new cards that we're going to get from Battle Boost in Ultra Prism. So the first card we're going to talk about is going to be Araquanid. And you guys actually might be thinking, hey, you just said you're not going to talk about reprints, but this is kind of an exception because one new thing that it seems to be a trend for the later half of the Sun and Moon block that we're entering is that Japan has been starting to print these alternate typing reprints of cards that already exist. So what I mean by that is there is an Araquanid, I believe it's back from Sun and Moon. It's basically the same card as this, but water type and, water energy costs. And so one thing Japan has started doing is printing basically the same cards, but with alternate typing and alternate energy requirements, which is actually kind of cool. They are kind of reprints, but they're basically still new cards. That's why we're still going to talk about them. So let's look at Araquanid. Like I said, this is almost exactly the same card that we got back from Sun and Moon, but it is a grass type and not a water type. It has this ability, a water bubble, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's fire Pokemon. And then it has a kind of a vanilla attack for a grass energy instead of a water, and double colorless, you do 70 damage. So like I said, very similar to the other one before, but now as a grass type. And so the old water one has seen a small amount of play here and there. It's popped up in some rogue decks at different points. So I feel like the same would still hold true for this one as well. One thing that I think is problematic for the other one that previously came out is this ability is great in a grass-based deck, or really any deck that is weak to fire. But, if you have to run water energy, that can kind of be a pain because you're probably running a grass deck already. And, it would kind of force you to play something like Rainbow Energy or Unit Energy in order to be able to accommodate the water version of Araquanid. So this one's actually kind of nice because if you already have a grass deck and you were eyeing down Araquanid, maybe the grass one here is a better consideration because you don't have to change your energies that you're running in your deck. So I think that is a consideration. The only downside though is that if you are running this grass one instead of the water Araquanid, you are not hitting fire Pokemon for weakness, which is a big thing as well, since if you are playing a fire weak deck, you ideally want a Pokemon that can handle the weakness and put on some pressure, because Aqua Edge, just as is not a very very strong attack. With a choice band, you do hit for 100, which will two-shot some of the popular fire Pokemon like Volcanion, Turtonator GX, etc., as long as they don't have a Fighting Fury belt. But generally speaking, the damage output on this is quite weak. If you had been running the water one, then you can just take a one-hit knockout with the water one. Of course, like I said, your energy counts in your deck do have to change, which can make your energy a little bit more inconsistent at times, but you never know. The extra offensive capability of hitting for weakness against these Pokemon who hit your deck for weakness can sometimes be better. Because sometimes also if you have to two-shot your opponent, that might give them an extra turn to find that Guzma to just play around this thing. So I might seem a little negative, but honestly I do still kind of like this card. The other one has seen play at certain points, and this thing is pretty easy to get out. We have things like the new Leafeon GX, which we talked about at great length in our regular set review, that can make getting out a stage 1 like this very simple to do. So I think that is an option. You could potentially play this in like Leafeon Decidui, or previously Araquanid saw play in various rogue like anti-metagame decks, so it could pop up like that as well. But overall, I'm just going to say keep an eye out for it. You know, the other one has popped up here and there just because its ability has been so strong. And I think this one, you know, it could be the same, especially since we don't have that new Solgaleo GX that removes weakness or anything like that. This could be a decent way to cover your grass Pokemon's weakness, or even metal decks are weak to fire as well. I'm not sure if you'd want a grass Pokemon in your metal deck, just because there's not really a great way to power it up in that type of deck. But like I said, I think this is worth consideration and a card I would say keep an eye on. It might pop up at some point. So next up on our list we have a new Magearna. And so this is a new Magearna. It's a non-GX, non-EX, just a regular one with 90 hit points, fire weakness, 1 retreat, has an attack for a metal and DCE to do 60. Nothing too special there, but the reason we're taking a look at it is for its ability to change clothes. So once during your turn before you attack me, put a Pokemon tool card attached to one of your Pokemon into your hand. At first glance, this might look like kind of like a simple, maybe even like a trivial ability, but I don't think you should underestimate how good this ability actually is. In the past, we've had players play things like Genesect EX literally just for its ability that lets you take a tool card attached to Genesect and put it back into your hand. Very, very powerful card that we've seen in different decks pop up, you know, probably in the last, I'd say maybe year and a half, something like that. But Genesect is a 2-prize Pokemon. You can't really attack with it. Well, you can in certain decks, I should say. But Genesect, you know, it's kind of awkward to power up in decks that don't run ways to accelerate metal energy. And it's also very limited in the way that you can get back tools to your hand. Like, you can only put tools attached to Genesect back into your hand, and you can't Bridget it out since it's a Pokemon EX, not GX. That means you can only get Genesect with Bridget as opposed to the 3 normal basics that you could get. So I think Genesect definitely has some definite problems with it, and I think Magearna does a really nice job at covering those pitfalls that Genesect previously had. Now, of course, like I said, Genesect, you can actually attack with it and do decent damage in metal decks, but other than that, I think Magearna just outclasses it. It only gives up 1 prize. The ability is much more flexible. And we've actually seen this ability before in the expanded format. There was I believe it's a Masquerain, played with the Tool Drop Trubbish and the Toolbox Sigilif. You know, to do lots of damage, you could pick up your tools and all sorts of things like that. But now this ability is printed on a basic, which is even better. And one thing I really want to try out too is maybe revitalizing some of the mega decks that we have in the format, or even in the expanded format, because now you have an easy way of removing your Spirit Links and putting on better tool cards like Choice Bands, Float Stones, and things of that nature as well. But also, I do think this card has some applications in standard format as well. So I think decks like, take Golisopod GX just as an example. You know, typically your deck runs Float Stones and things like that. And sometimes, you know, maybe you attack with a Golisopod and you can't find a Guzma or Acerola to get your Golisopod back on the bench. But you might have something on your bench that has a Float Stone. Just as an example, you can pick up Float Stone, put it on Golisopod, and then actually retreat. So I think that is a deck in standard format. I would like to experiment with this card, but just in general, like I said, I think this ability is very strong, and I think it's a card that you might see pop up here and there over the course of its span in standard format. So I don't think there's a super broken use for this card right when it gets printed, but I think this ability is too good not to see play at some point. Next up, we actually have our first fairy type Pokemon of either set review. So this is actually something I was very curious about. I noticed Ultra Sun and Moon, Japan's main equivalent to Ultra Prism, had no fairy Pokemon in the set. So kind of glad that Battle Boost gave us a couple cards to put in Ultra Prism that were fairy type. So the first of which that we are going to discuss is going to be Shiinotic. It's another one of these alternate typing reprints. So this is actually basically the same one that we got all the way back from Sun and Moon, which was previously a grass type, but now it is a fairy type. So let's take a look at 100 hit points, 2 retreat cost, kind of a mediocre attack, etc. But the reason we are even going to discuss it is for its ability Illuminate. So once during your turn before you attack, you may search your deck for a fairy Pokemon, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So at first glance, I actually think this ability looks, you know, not too bad. You know, even the Shiinotic back from Sun and Moon had a bit of hype coming into the set before it got released. And, you know, if you did see our Sun and Moon set review, you probably might remember that we were pretty excited about Shiinotic. We thought it was a pretty decent card. And you might be thinking, well, why is this one so bad? Well, the reason that this one is bad is because of its typing, to be honest. The only reason the Shiinotic from Sun and Moon had hype was because it was a grass type. That means you could abuse Forest of Giant Plants with it and immediately, you know, evolve into a Shiinotic and start searching out even additional grass type Pokemon. So specifically in Vileplume variants, Shiinotic saw a little bit of play. I think some people tried it out in Decidueye, ourselves included. I think it wound up being a little bit underwhelming there. But specifically in like Lurantis Vileplume builds, I remember Shiinotic, you know, popping up here and there. But we don't have Forest of Giant Plants anymore, especially for fairy types at that. So we don't have a quick way to get this thing out. That's a problem I have with it. And also think what fairy decks are popular in the current format. So we have Gardevoir GX. Okay, so this makes some sense on paper. You could pair this with Gardevoir GX, but I would argue why not just play Octillery? You have, you know, Octillery is just a much more versatile Pokemon. It has a 2 retreat cost just like Shiinotic, so it's not even like you gain like an easier retreating Pokemon by playing this over Octillery. But Octillery is just generally more useful. It has, you know, synergy with Gallade to basically stack the top of your deck at all times and draw exactly what you need. Sometimes you also just don't need a Pokemon. Sometimes you need energy. Sometimes you need supporters. So I think this card is too limited in its use to really outclass Octillery in Gardevoir. So then I might think, well, okay, what else do we have? We have Xerneas variants, but really that's pretty much an all basic deck to begin with outside of your Xerneas breaks, which are still pretty easy to get out. So I don't think Shiinotic really helps you out any in that type of deck either, just because your Pokemon are already so easy to get in play as it is. And the only other one I can really think of is Sylveon GX. And the thing is, with Sylveon, Eevee already sets up the deck for you. You just attach a Fairy Energy, you immediately evolve into Sylveon and get going. So I just think Shiinotic doesn't really have a place in any deck. I don't think this ability is very bad, like being able to search your deck for, you know, a Pokemon to evolve and all sorts of things like that. It's a little consistency booster. I mean, just to be fair, but I just think this card is just outclassed by so many other things. You know, maybe in the future, once a lot of cards rotate and maybe some of our support Pokemon options get more limited, maybe Shiinotic will be a consideration. And also depending on what fairy cards get printed in the future, maybe this will see some play. But as for right now, guys, I just think this is outclassed by other support Pokemon. It's just not a card that's really needed at this time. Next up, we have one of the most interesting cards in the set, and that is going to be a reprint of the Psychic type promo Tapu Lele, but that card actually has not been even really officially released internationally, at least here in the United States. You know, that promo box was supposed to come out literally like 6 months ago, and it's been delayed and delayed. So this is actually our first time getting this Lele. So the other one that was, you know, seeing some hype was a Psychic type, and this is going to be a Fairy type. So let's take a look at it and see maybe if the typing of this card still makes it good. So let's take a look at it. It has Psywave for a Fairy Energy, 20 times the amount of energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So this is like an okay little one prize attacking card. You know, if your opponent has 3 energy, just for the sake of example, you're going to be doing 60 damage, which is not that great. And there's really not a whole lot of Pokemon that are popular that are weak to Fairy. Granted, if Alolan Exeggutor GX gets popular for some reason, to be fair, you could hit Alolan Exeggutor for a pretty good amount of damage. Also, Dialga GX, if that sees play, this could actually do a good amount of damage to Dialga. But outside of those situations, I think Psywave is kind of underwhelming. But the real reason Tapu Lele, specifically the Psychic type version of this card, has had so much attention given to it is because of its second attack magical swap. For a Fairy Energy and a colorless, move any number of damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon to their other Pokemon in any way that you like. So this is a very powerful attack, but specifically more so on the Psychic type version, because in the expanded format we have Dimension Valley, which means you can use this attack for just a single Psychic Energy in that format, which is very relevant in several decks. We have things like Trevenant, which play, you know, Dimension Valley, and the whole deck's is based around spreading damage. Similarly, we have Necrozma GX being played in Garbodor variants and expanded, which can spread a lot of damage. And sometimes, literally, you can just do one spread with something like a Necrozma, and then use attack like this to clean up knockouts. You know, we've seen players, including even myself, try out Meowstic in some of these decks to, you know, kind of hold us over until we got the Psychic type Tapu Lele. So this attack is very, very strong, but I'm not sold on it being on a fairy type. That is the big downside to this card. You know, however, I'm still going to try to be a little optimistic because in expanded format, we still can use the Mew from Fates Collide to copy the attacks of basic Pokemon. So maybe until the Psychic type Tapu Lele comes out, if you are playing that Garbodor style deck, you know, that plays Necrozma and things like that. If you're playing Mew, you can actually still copy this attack for just a single Rainbow Energy, since those decks do play Rainbow Energy in their lists as well. You know, that is a little bit clunkier. You do have to draw into the Rainbow, which is harder to draw into than a Psychic, but you do still have the option to do so. But outside of that, I don't think there's a whole lot of use for this card currently. You know, I look at the decks that we have in standard format. Specifically, we have Gardevoir, where Magical Swap, not too relevant just because most of the time Gardevoir can take one-hit knockouts. So I'm not sure if I even want to commit 2 energy to this when I could commit 2 energy to something like a Gallade instead to do 130 damage, or I could just put more energy onto a Gardevoir to take one-hit knockouts. Similarly, Xerneas variants, they aim to take big one-hit knockouts as well. And then Sylveon doesn't really try to even do damage a lot of the time. So in standard format, I think that the use for this card is so limited. I don't expect it to see a whole lot of play, but I think the use with Mew in expanded format it's decent enough to worth mentioning. That deck already plays Rainbow Energy, so it can abuse this if it does choose to do so. It might be a little clunky, but I do think the option is there, and I don't think it's to be, you know, understated how good this ability or this attack actually is. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out for it, but definitely once the Psychic type version finally releases, I think it will just outclass this card completely. But like I said, keep an eye out on it, and maybe in the meantime this card might pop up in some capacity. Alright guys, so next up we have Alolan Exeggutor. This is going to be a non-GX one, and honestly I completely forgot this card existed until we got the set list for Ultra Prism, so happy to be able to revisit it. So let's take a look at it and see what it's all about. So this is a non-GX Alolan Exeggutor. So it's a stage 1 with 130 hit points, which is actually a pretty respectable amount. You do still have pesky things like that weakness to Fairy and that 3 retreat cost, but one good thing is that you can play Heavy Ball to search this thing out if need be. Specifically, if you're pairing Exeggutor with Venusaur anyways, Heavy Ball might be a good consideration. But the reason we're looking at this Pokemon is for its first attack, Exeggutor's Paradise. So for each of your benched Execute, search your deck for an Alolan Exeggutor or Alolan Exeggutor GX and put it onto that Execute to evolve it, and shuffle your deck. So this is actually a pretty decent attack in the context of the Alolan Exeggutor deck. So one problem Execute has had is that they have an extremely low amount of HP, and sometimes things like Buzzwole or maybe even the new Glaceon GX could easily pick them off with bench damage. So having an Exeggutor like this that can immediately evolve your Executes in play is actually pretty good. You know, we talked so much about how Leafeon GX is good because of its Grand Bloom GX attack. This is kind of a similar thing, but specifically just for Executes, which is still, I think, okay in the context of this Alolan Exeggutor deck. So the fact that you don't need energy is also pretty good as well, because you can, you know, maybe put your energy on one of your benched Executes to start powering up an Alolan Exeggutor GX, and you know, set up behind this Alolan Exeggutor that you can wall with for a few turns. Now, having said that, you still have to remember you are ultimately playing an Alolan Exeggutor deck, which is not that great. So yes, I think this is good in the context of Alolan Exeggutor GX as a deck, but just that deck in general, not the strongest. But lately Gardevoir has been falling out of favor with players, which makes its Fairy weakness a little less relevant. And if that's the case, I think this card, you know, Alolan Exeggutor GX more specifically, has a better chance at being played. Like I said, specifically with Venusaur, I think that's the best partner that card probably has at the moment. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out on this card. I think this card makes complete sense in an Alolan Exeggutor deck, but it just is unfortunate that that deck itself is not the best. But like I said, if you are going to play that deck, this seems like an automatic inclusion, so we'll have to see how it goes. I think this card is basically only as good as the Alolan Exeggutor GX deck itself. So like I said, for that reason, keep an eye out on it. Maybe, who knows, maybe that deck will be popular at some point. So that's actually going to be the end of the Pokemon that we're going to look at. There were some others that got printed, but they were mainly reprints, or they weren't really relevant for discussion, I don't think. So moving on to our trainer cards, we have Ancient Crystal. So this is a new tool card, and the Regirock, Regice, Registeel, or Regigigas this card is attached to take 30 less damage from your opponent's attacks. So that's actually kind of interesting. You know, we had all of those Regi Pokemon come out in Crimson Invasion previously, so Ancient Crystal, of course, looks to give that type of archetype a little bit more support. But I have to be honest, guys, I don't think this card is very good at all, just because Fighting Fury Belt exists, and Fighting Fury Belt, you get 40 more hit points, and your attacks do 10 more damage. So I think as long as we have Fighting Fury Belt, it just outclasses Ancient Crystal. Now, of course, Ancient Crystal is going to be better against decks that have to two-shot your Regis, just because you essentially get to make use of this effect multiple times. But in the context of being one-hit KO'd, Fury Belt just makes a lot more sense to me. But even if you are playing Ancient Crystal and your opponent has to two-shot you, I don't know if this is going to make enough difference as far as the math goes. Because you have to remember the Regis, you know, even though they have a decent amount of hit points for basic non-GXs, most decks can still two-shot them even with Ancient Crystal on them. The only exception might be Regigigas, but even still, I don't even know if that's really the case. So like I said, I think Fighting Fury Belt just completely outclasses this card. You know, maybe once that card rotates, we can revisit Ancient Crystal, and that's even, of course, if these Regi Pokemon are viable as a deck. But for right now, I just think this card is not very good. So next up, we have a couple of new memory cards for Silvally GX. So if you remember back from Crimson Invasion, we got the Silvally GX, and it had a couple of these memory cards that changed its typing, which is really cool because that allows you to, you know, kind of tech against what is popular in the metagame. So now we have the Lightning type memory and the Fire type memory. So they do the exact same thing when they're attached to Silvally GX. It changes them to either Lightning or Fire type, depending on which memory you have attached, of course. So just like the other memories we discussed back in our Crimson Invasion set review, I think these cards are still good, and you basically just have to pick what memories you want to use depending on how the metagame develops. Now, unfortunately, at the time of filming, the Lightning type memory is pretty irrelevant. There's not really any super popular Lightning Week Pokemon in the format at the time of filming, at least. Now, of course, the format always changes after every set, so we'll have to see you know, how that changes in the future. But luckily the Fire type memory is pretty relevant. You know, Metal got a ton of support in this set. Also, Leafeon GX looks to be a very popular Pokemon out of the set as well. So maybe Fire memory could actually see some play. But for right now, I think Lightning memory or Electric memory just not too relevant currently. But like I said, we'll have to keep an eye out on these as the metagame continues to shift. And you never know, the Lightning type one might see play as well. But like I said, just in general, I think these cards are good and helps give Silvally GX some extra legs and constantly be able to adapt to the metagame as it does change. So yeah, guys, that's actually going to be pretty much it. Like I said, the other cards that were printed in the set weren't too relevant, or they were just literally exact reprints of other cards that we had already received. And so with that being said, my final thoughts still kind of remain the same about Ultra Prism, even after factoring in these other cards. You know, we did get a couple of more non-GX Pokemon to consider to play, but honestly I don't think any of them had an incredible impact on the game. You know, a couple of them aren't too bad, but overall they don't add or detract really anything from this set as a whole. So like I said, my final thoughts are still kind of going to be the same. We got some metal support, the Evolution GXs are good, we got things like Cynthia in this set. And all of my cons for the set still kind of remain the same. We still have a pretty weak selection of item cards that got printed. You know, the Prism Stars outside the Solgaleo Prism Star and maybe Cyrus aren't that great. But overall, I still think this is one of the best sets we've had in a while, especially after Crimson Invasion, which most people I think were a little let down by. It had a couple of good cards like Buzzwole and Silvally GX, but overall, I think the set just as a whole was a bit of a letdown. So Ultra Prism definitely still looks to be like a very highly impactful set, and one that I'm still very excited about to finally get released. But But yeah, guys, that's going to be pretty much it for this one. If you have not yet seen our first part of the Ultra Prism set review, I will have a link in the description for you guys to check out. But as usual, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you can support our channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, big shout out to all of our patrons over there, or by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would be greatly appreciated. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.